February 2009. Lake effect wind sweeps across the parking lot in Goderich, Ontario, and the yard outside the factory looks less like the center of a global machine business than the edge of a town waiting for bad news to become permanent. Two graders sit ready to leave. Not a parade. Not a ceremony. Just two machines, painted yellow, loaded quietly, their final destination across the Atlantic. They are reportedly headed to Egypt. What matters more than where they are going is what they represent. They are among the last road graders ever to leave this town. For nearly a century, machines like these rolled out of Goderich and into the world. They shaped roads in Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Latin America, the Middle East, northern mines, frozen highways, gravel county lines, and construction sites most of the people who built them would never see. The brand was Champion, and for a long time, if you operated a grader anywhere serious people graded roads, you knew the name. Then the name was taken apart in stages. First the ownership changed. Then the badges changed. Then the factory stopped mattering. Then the plant closed. Then the buyer that closed it eventually walked away from the very product line it had bought. This is the story of a company that spent generations becoming the best in the world at one thing, and then discovered that being the best at one thing is not the same as being safe. If stories like this matter to you, the factories, the brands, and the people buried inside them, subscribe to Rust and Glory. Before there was a factory in Goderich, before there was a Canadian company, before there was a yellow machine anybody in Alaska or Argentina could recognize at a glance, there was a simpler and older problem: roads that barely deserved the name. In the 19th century, much of North America still moved across surfaces that turned to mud in rain, dust in drought, and ruts in every season between. A road could exist on paper and fail in practice. It could connect one town to another and still punish every wagon that tried to cross it. In many places, maintenance was local, irregular, improvised, and underfunded. A bad road was not simply an inconvenience. It was lost time, broken axles, spoiled deliveries, damaged horses, delayed mail, and the small daily tax a young country paid for being bigger than its infrastructure. Out of that problem emerged Samuel Pennock. The facts that matter most are these: he came from southeastern Pennsylvania, from a Quaker family with a strong mechanical bent, and by the middle of the 19th century he was already part of a culture that treated tools and moral seriousness as compatible things. He had worked on agricultural machinery, patented earlier inventions with family members, and developed the kind of practical intelligence that does not begin with theory. It begins with friction, weight, leverage, and the stubborn refusal of material reality to cooperate unless somebody understands it properly. The American road problem was ready for exactly that kind of mind. As transportation needs grew, especially with the rise of better organized traffic and later the political pressure of the Good Roads movement, the old methods of scraping and smoothing road surfaces looked increasingly primitive. Pennock's great contribution was not that he invented the need. It was that he gave it a machine that could be standardized, repeated, sold, improved, and scaled. In 1877, Samuel Pennock patented the road machine that became known as the American Champion. In historical terms, that machine matters because it represents the transition from rough, local, almost makeshift grading tools to a more coherent and recognizably modern form of road-shaping equipment. It gave the work a chassis, an identity, and a brand durable enough to outlive its founder by generations. The name mattered. Champion was not merely descriptive. It was aspirational. The machine was being sold as the answer to a problem everybody already felt in their teeth. That is one of the reasons industrial brands can become so durable. They do not begin by flattering the customer. They begin by solving an irritation so old and constant that people stop believing it can be solved well. When a company fixes that irritation reliably enough, the company stops feeling optional. It starts to feel like part of the landscape. Pennock's business expanded in the decades that followed through road machinery, agricultural equipment, and the long churn of late 19th century industrial reorganization. Names changed. Firms merged. Assets moved. Patents accumulated. But underneath the administrative changes, the thing that mattered remained very stable. The champion lineage was becoming attached to the business of shaping the ground itself. And that business was about to become much larger than one Pennsylvania inventor could have imagined. The bicycle era intensified demands for better surfaces. Provincial and state authorities began treating roads less like local inconveniences and more like public systems. Engineers and reformers increasingly understood that mobility required maintenance, and maintenance required machines. A market that had once been fragmented and occasional was turning durable. What Pennock gave that market was more than hardware. He gave it a direction. A road grader is a humble machine compared with the giants that came later in mining, steel, locomotives, or automobiles. It does not haul ore. It does not pour concrete. It does not electrify cities. But it prepares the surface that lets everything else move. It is infrastructure before the road becomes infrastructure. It is one of those machines that vanish into the background precisely because they are so fundamental. This story begins there because that is where the logic begins. Champion did not emerge from glamour. It emerged from necessity. And companies born from necessity often become very good at surviving. They learn discipline earlier. They learn that customers will forgive plainness more easily than unreliability. They learn that a machine does not have to be admired if it can be trusted. That culture, practical, unromantic, obsessed with function, would remain visible in Champion long after the company crossed a border, changed names, and became Canadian in everything but ancestry. The road machine moved north because the problem moved north. Canada did not need graders in the abstract. It needed them because distance in Canada is not a metaphor. It is a governing condition. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Canadian transportation problem was as physical and unforgiving as the land itself. Towns were separated by large spans of rough country. Weather could wreck a surface faster than a local authority could repair it. Rural settlement, agricultural development, county road building, and later provincial highway ambitions all generated demand for machines that could turn loose earth and broken stone into something passable. The need was real enough to support manufacturing, but the right location still mattered. The Champion line entered Canada through manufacturing and licensing arrangements in Ontario, and after early failures, reorganizations, and changes in ownership, the decisive geographic answer became Goderich. Goderich is an unusually elegant town for the story it would come to tell. It sits on Lake Huron with a deep water harbor, a railway connection, and a layout that gave it a civic distinctiveness rare in small industrial communities. The famous octagonal square made it memorable. The harbor made it useful. The surrounding county gave it an agricultural hinterland and labor force. Those are not minor details. Industrial history often depends less on abstract genius than on freight, wages, and access. Why Goderich? Because heavy machines are not only built, they must also be moved. A lake harbor matters when you are sending large, high-value industrial equipment outward. Rail matters when you are drawing in steel, components, and customers. A smaller town also matters when labor costs are lower than in larger industrial centers and a factory can become one of the organizing employers of local life. By the early 20th century, the Canadian operation that would eventually become Dominion Road Machinery had settled in Goderich, and one bureaucratic fact turned out to be more important than anyone at the time could fully know. The Canadian company acquired a separate corporate identity from the American parent. That sounds dry, but dry legal structure sometimes becomes industrial destiny. When the American side later stumbled, the Canadian operation had a measure of independence that helped it survive. In history, empires do not always persist because they are strongest at the center. Sometimes they persist because a peripheral unit was organized just differently enough to live through a collapse elsewhere. That mattered enormously for Champion. The American lineage supplied the invention and the brand origin, but Goderich supplied continuity. By the early 1930s, the Canadian operation had become in practice the heart of the Champion story. The old Pennsylvania idea had been rehoused on the shore of Lake Huron. This is where the scale of the story begins to turn. Most industrial decline stories start with large, obvious power and end in rust. Champion's story is subtler because the factory that came to define the brand was not in a giant metropolis. It was in a town that even many Canadians could pass through without understanding how globally connected it had once been. That mismatch between the size of the place and the reach of the product is one of the most striking things about Goderich. By 1915, the Canadian entity had been reorganized as Dominion Road Machinery Company Limited. Again, that sounds administrative. It was actually foundational. The company in Goderich now had a durable institutional shell. Roads were becoming a system. Governments were becoming more serious about them. Provincial departments, highway authorities, and later national development programs all needed machines to shape and maintain surfaces. A machine that could earn trust at the county level could rise with the road network itself. And Canada's road network was not merely local. It was national in the making. A country of extreme geography does not build roads casually. It builds them as statecraft. Every smoother route between communities, every better maintained rural surface, every upgraded corridor between towns is a small act of national integration. That gave road equipment makers a peculiar importance. They participated in state formation without ever sounding grand enough to say so. Goderich was therefore not just a factory town. It was a node in a larger national story about mobility, development, and physical cohesion. The prettiness of the town did not cancel that. It intensified it. Because the factory stood within a place that people could plausibly love, Champion never felt like an anonymous industrial sprawl. It felt like one industry among the lake, the harbor, the square, the salt, the county, and the local memory. That made the eventual loss feel different. When a giant city loses one plant, it hurts. When a small town loses the factory that carried its name around the world, it changes the town's understanding of itself. The move to Goderich was therefore not a footnote to the Champion story. It was the moment the story found the place that would carry it the furthest. A horse-drawn grader can shape a road. A self-propelled grader can transform an industry. That is the engineering hinge on which Champion's middle history turns. The early road machines had done important work, but they still belonged to a world in which traction came from animals and mechanical control was often laborious. Operators worked with muscle, patience, and simple systems. Productivity had limits. Precision had limits. Operator fatigue had limits. The future belonged to machines that could move themselves and be controlled with more fluidity. Champion made that leap earlier and more decisively than many of its rivals. By the late 1920s, the company was experimenting with powered graders that combined tractor technology with grading frames. What began as a practical mechanical improvisation became the basis of a deeper strategic transformation. If the machine could propel itself, the grader was no longer just an implement. It became a full vehicle class with its own engineering pathway. That matters because industrial leadership often comes from identifying the moment when a support technology stops being an add-on and becomes the essence of the product. For Champion, propulsion and control were not secondary improvements. They redefined the machine. The next breakthrough mattered even more. In the 1930s, Champion pioneered hydraulic control in motor graders. That does not sound dramatic until you think about what it changed. Before hydraulics, adjusting a blade meant relying on slower, more mechanical systems. With hydraulics, the operator could manipulate the blade with a degree of speed, force, and precision that fundamentally changed the work. The machine became less punishing to run, more responsive under load, and more effective in a wide range of conditions. This is the point where Champion stopped being merely competent and started building a reputation that could travel. Because reliability travels. Word of mouth in heavy equipment is often more honest than corporate advertising. Operators talk. Fleet managers compare notes. Municipal authorities remember which machines stayed running when the weather turned ugly. Contractors remember which machines cost them time. On a glamorous product, a company can survive on image for a while. On road machinery, image is thinner. The product has to work. Champion kept making decisions that favored that reputation. It improved traction. It refined blade control. It built increasingly specialized machines for the specific conditions customers faced. That is one reason the company later became so strong in export markets. It did not design purely for one neat climate or one road authority. It designed for punishment. The grader range expanded, the machines became more capable, and the company gradually concentrated its attention on the product class that made its name. This is also where the story acquires one of its central tensions. Specialization was Champion's great strength. It was also the seed of its vulnerability. In the middle decades of the 20th century, specialization looked like genius. While larger equipment companies spread themselves across multiple categories, loaders, excavators, dozers, backhoes, and more, Champion increasingly defined itself through the motor grader. That meant engineers, product planners, factory workers, dealers, and customers all developed a sharper sense of what the company was for. It meant the firm was less distracted. It meant improvements compounded inside one product category. The result was a brand that came to be associated not with industrial breadth, but with industrial depth. If Caterpillar was a sprawling empire, Champion was the specialist. There is always dignity in that position. Sometimes even superiority. A focused company can know its product in a way a giant conglomerate never quite can. By the 1950s and 1960s, that focus was translating into market authority. Champion graders were not just present. They were respected. The machines had evolved from road implements into serious, globally competitive heavy equipment. Goderich was no longer just building for Ontario roads or Canadian counties. It was building a family of machines suited to a world increasingly dependent on maintained surfaces. And that is how a modest industrial lineage becomes an empire without ever looking like one. The company did not need skyscrapers, glamorous advertising, or a giant consumer-facing name. It had something more enduring in its own sector, a machine class that governments, contractors, mines, and road departments came to trust. The road grader had learned to move itself. Champion, in a deeper sense, had learned to move the world. The most important strategic choice Champion ever made was also the riskiest. It gave itself almost nothing to hide behind. By the mid-20th century, the company increasingly concentrated on graders as its defining product. Other firms diversified. Champion narrowed. On paper, that can look reckless. In practice, for decades, it looked brilliant. This is one of the essential differences between a specialist manufacturer and an industrial giant. A giant can survive mediocrity in one division because another division absorbs the shock. A specialist cannot. The specialist must be right again and again because it has fewer excuses. But when the specialist is right, it can be extraordinarily hard to beat. Champion poured engineering effort into graders because graders were the whole point. The product line expanded from practical municipal machines to larger and more capable equipment for harder jobs. The company's name on the side of the machine came to signify not breadth, but focus. And for many buyers, focus is persuasive. When you purchase a complex industrial machine, the promise that the manufacturer thinks about that class of machine every day can matter more than the size of the corporate parent. This was the era in which Champion became, in a meaningful sense, a grading culture. That culture lived in design decisions, field support, operator reputation, dealer relations, and the habits of a factory that understood exactly what it made. There is power in repetition when the repetition is intelligent. A workforce building the same family of machines decade after decade develops a practical archive in muscle memory. Welders know what stress does to certain structures. Assemblers notice patterns in fit and failure. Product people hear recurring field complaints and learn which ones matter. Improvement stops being theoretical. It becomes the product of thousands of small corrections accumulating through time. The machines themselves reflected that evolution. Champion gained a reputation for hydraulic sophistication, operator usability, and design features that made the grader not merely workable but preferred. Later models, especially in the post-war decades, strengthened the sense that the company was not just making graders but pushing the category forward. Even its more unusual creations served that role. The giant mining-class machines that became part of Champion lore, the enormous models built for surface mines and extreme industrial contexts, mattered not only because a few units sold. They mattered because they dramatized competence. They told the market that a company based in a relatively small Ontario town could think at any scale the work demanded. This is how industrial prestige operates. A company does not need to dominate every market to shape perception. It needs a few emblematic products that convince customers its capabilities run deep. Champion's biggest graders did that. So did its more practical bread-and-butter models for municipal and contractor fleets. Together they created a ladder of credibility. From county roads to mine haul roads, from modest budgets to extreme applications, the company could plausibly claim it understood the category better than almost anyone. But every strength has a shape, and the shape of this strength was narrow. Champion was building a company around a single machine class in a world where consolidation was coming. That would matter later. For now, the gamble looked like a masterstroke. By the 1970s, even the corporate name began to catch up with the market reality. Dominion Road Machinery had long lived in the shadow of the Champion brand painted on its machines. Renaming the company to Champion Road Machinery was less a reinvention than an admission. The market had already decided what the firm was. Management simply made the paperwork match the public truth. There is something beautiful and dangerous in that kind of clarity. Beautiful because the company finally looked as focused as it had become. Dangerous because clarity of identity can harden into dependency. If the market shifts or ownership changes, there is nowhere to retreat. A diversified company can rebalance. A single product company must either defend its one idea successfully or watch its entire structure wobble. 4 decades Champion defended it successfully. The world wanted roads. Roads needed grading. The company that specialized in grading kept getting better at the work. That is why this middle chapter of the story feels so secure. Not because the future was safe, but because the present was extraordinarily competent. The tragedy of many industrial decline stories is not that the companies involved were weak. It is that they were often very good at what had once mattered most. Champion belongs to that category. It was not a drifting brand living on nostalgia. It was a serious manufacturer that had made a serious strategic bet and, for a long time, won. A factory becomes real not when the annual report says it exists, but when a town begins arranging its life around the shifts. At 160 Maitland Road in Goderich, the Champion plant was not merely a workplace. It was one of the economic and psychological anchors of the community. In a town whose population remained small by urban standards, a factory employing hundreds of people mattered in a different way than it would have in a metropolis. The plant was large enough to radiate influence outward into stores, suppliers, restaurants, trucking routes, rail links, family plans, mortgages, and the ordinary assumptions people make about where a decent life can be built. The physical setup gave Champion advantages that were not abstract. The plant stood near harbor access, with road and rail connections that helped move heavy finished machines out and materials in. That mattered because graders are not polite products. They are heavy, awkward, and logistically demanding. Shipping them efficiently is not an afterthought. It is part of the business model. Inside the plant, work moved in stages from steel to machine. Plate and structural parts became frames. Precision machining created the components that had to withstand punishing lateral stress. Hydraulic systems were assembled and installed by people who understood that failure in service would not happen in a controlled lab. It would happen on a remote road, on a winter route, or in a contractor fleet already under pressure. A sealing problem that looked minor inside the plant could become expensive and humiliating in the field. Good factories understand that what they are really shipping is not a unit. It is a reputation. Champion's workers understood that too. By the late 20th century, the Goderich plant employed roughly 500 people. In a town of well under 10,000, that is not just payroll. It is presence. It means many residents know someone who works there, used to work there, hopes to work there, or depends indirectly on the wages earned there. It means the factory ceases to be one employer among many and becomes part of the local social grammar. This is why industrial closures feel so different in small towns. They are not simply economic events. They are revisions of scale. They tell a place that what once seemed central is now peripheral. They tell workers that skills accumulated over decades may not map cleanly onto the new economy. They tell younger people that inheritance has narrowed. Before any of that happened, though, Champion still carried a different emotional weight. It was a source of pride. A town on Lake Huron could point to machines leaving for continents most residents would never visit. A worker could say, with no exaggeration, that what he or she helped build in Goderich might end up shaping roads in another hemisphere. That is a rare and serious kind of dignity, the dignity of tangible work whose reach exceeds the worker's own horizon. Factories generate that feeling through repetition. The same gate, the same parking lot, the same lunch rooms, the same noise, the same smells, the same skilled motions repeated until they become ordinary. And because they become ordinary, it is easy for outsiders to misunderstand them. A factory worker's mastery often looks simple only because it has been made to look simple by practice. Champion's plant carried decades of that practice. The expertise was embedded not only in formal engineering but in informal knowledge. Who could spot a flaw by sound, who knew which fit was off by feel, who remembered how an older design change solved a recurring field problem. That form of knowledge is hard to value correctly in a spreadsheet. It is not because it has no value. It is because its value is distributed. It lives in people, and once people are dispersed, the knowledge does not always survive in the same usable form. That matters later, when acquisition and closure begin translating a living industrial organism into categories like redundancy, transfer, rationalization, and cost. For a long time though, Goderich still felt like the right scale for Champion. Not too large to lose its identity. Not too small to support serious manufacturing. The town square and harbor gave it a civic personality that coexisted with the plant rather than disappearing beneath it. Champion did not erase Goderich. It became one of the ways Goderich understood itself. That relationship cuts both ways. Towns lend factories stability, loyalty, and labor continuity. Factories lend towns wages, institutional confidence, and a place in larger maps. When the relationship works, the two begin to appear natural to each other. The Champion plant in Goderich came to feel natural in exactly that way. Which is another reason the ending would later feel so jarring. Natural things are supposed to age. They are not supposed to vanish because exchange rates moved and a multinational found a more convenient footprint in another country. Champion's reach is one of the most remarkable things about the company, and one of the easiest to underestimate if you only look at the map of Ontario. The factory was in Goderich. The market was global. That is not rhetoric. By the late 20th century Champion machines had been sold into more than 95 countries. The phrase appears in company histories because it deserves to. It means the brand that began with an American patent and matured in a small Canadian town had become legible across continents. Operators in one place recognized machines built by workers in another place because the product had proven itself repeatedly under real conditions. This global spread did not happen by accident. It happened because graders occupy a useful overlap between public infrastructure and heavy industry. Governments need them. Contractors need them. Mines need them. Forestry and resource access roads need them. Airports and municipalities need them. Developing countries need them. Mature economies need them. A grader is not a luxury product tied to one consumer cycle. It is a work product attached to the long, uneven, and always recurring need to build and maintain surfaces. That gave Champion an opportunity larger than its size. The company could not match giants like Caterpillar across every product segment, but it did not need to. It only needed to persuade buyers that when it came to graders, the specialist from Goderich knew the machine better. In market after market, that seems to have worked. New Zealand became a particularly vivid example, with Champion machines establishing a long presence in government and contractor fleets. Elsewhere, the graders reached mining operations, snow belts, export markets with Commonwealth ties, Latin American job sites, Middle Eastern infrastructure work, and far-flung public works programs. The company also established a manufacturing presence in Brazil, a sign that the export story had grown large enough to justify a more international production footprint. What is striking here is not merely the number of countries. It is the asymmetry between brand recognition and place recognition. Many people who knew Champion as a machine brand would not have known anything about Goderich. Yet Goderich was where the identity had been forged. The town remained invisible while the machine became visible. That is common in industrial history. Places do the work of making products whose names travel farther than the places themselves. This section of the story matters because it clarifies what was later lost. Champion was not some marginal regional maker bought up by a larger rival out of pity or convenience. It was a serious global brand in its category. It had credibility, a dealer network, export history, loyal customers, and engineering substance. The point is not that it was the biggest company in earthmoving. It was not. The point is that it had carved out a distinguished place in one demanding machine class and defended it internationally. That level of success changes the emotional texture of the later acquisition. If a weak firm gets bought and folded, the market shrugs. If a specialist with global stature gets bought and hollowed out, the story becomes less about rescue and more about absorption. Inside Champion's success, however, the future problem was already present. The company had world reach, but not giant company scale. It had reputation, but not the balance sheet protection of a diversified conglomerate. It had one great answer to the market, the greater, but only one. And history is often cruel to companies whose identity is both their source of prestige and the narrowest point in their corporate structure. Still, at the summit, none of that was obvious in the way it later would be. From the factory floor, the story still looked like expansion, competence, and endurance. Machines left for the world. Orders arrived. Product lines evolved. The very fact that a town of Goderich's size could sustain such reach probably made it feel even more earned. That is why this chapter needs to be remembered not as a prelude to collapse but as its own accomplishment. Champion truly did become one of the great specialist road machinery names in the world. The later loss matters precisely because the earlier achievement was real. By the early 1990s, Champion looked like the kind of company people confuse with permanence. The brand was strong. The products were respected. The export story was real. The Canadian dollar, for much of the period, was favorable enough to make manufacturing in Goderich comparatively competitive. The plant had a skilled workforce, a stable local identity, and a market position that should have counted for something. Not number one across all heavy equipment, but an unusually strong and respected player in motor graders. If you were standing inside that moment, it would have been easy to think the company had solved the hardest part of the problem. It knew what it was. It had customers. It had engineering credibility. It had a plant. It had a town. It had history. In the short term, it had all the ingredients of endurance. But the summit of a company can also be the last point at which its vulnerabilities are still flattering. Champion's greatest strength was focus. Its greatest weakness was also focus. One primary machine class. One principal manufacturing center. One small-town industrial ecology. One place where a shift in costs, ownership priorities, or currency could hit the whole business with unusual force. That alone would not have guaranteed disaster. Plenty of specialist firms survive by staying excellent. The larger problem was the world around Champion. Trade liberalization was changing the operating environment. The competitive pressure from giant multinational equipment makers was intensifying. The old tariff structures and national protections that had once allowed smaller manufacturers more breathing room were eroding. The market was not necessarily closing for specialists, but it was becoming less forgiving. And then there was ownership structure. Champion was a public company. Public companies can be admired and profitable while also being available. That matters. Availability changes how a strong specialist is seen by larger firms. It stops being a self-contained story and becomes a potential asset package. Product line, engineering, dealer relationships, brand equity, customer base, factory, talent. The stronger the specialist, the more legible it becomes to acquisitive buyers. In that sense, Champion's success made it vulnerable. It had become valuable enough to buy but not large enough to resist every buyer. It had deep product expertise but not the sprawling defensive scale of an industrial giant. It had a great machine but not a broad enough product universe to make takeover unattractive. This is also where macroeconomics begins to matter more than shop floor excellence. The cost advantage supplied by a relatively low Canadian dollar could not be treated as a permanent law of nature. Exchange rates move. Policies change. Free trade rearranges the map on which factories compete. A plant that looks strong under one cost regime can suddenly look exposed under another. That is not the fault of the workers or of the product. It is one of the structural cruelties of industrial capitalism. A factory can become more efficient, more disciplined, and more technically capable and still lose if the larger framework moves against it. When that happens, management often continues talking in the language of improvement because improvement is the only language workers can act on. But the outcome may already be migrating toward decisions the factory cannot influence. Champion's board and shareholder structure also placed the company in the orbit of capital markets rather than purely local loyalty. Again, this is not a moral failure. It is a condition. Once a company becomes the sort of thing that can be valued, tendered, and absorbed, another story begins running parallel to the one told on the factory floor. One story says, "We build great graders." The other says, "We are an acquisition candidate." The problem with that second story is that it often becomes legible too late to the people whose lives depend on the first one. By the mid-1990s, Champion was near its highest point in prestige and reach. That is the moment at which the ending became most dangerous, because the company still looked healthy enough to be worth buying. Healthy enough to be worth buying is not the same thing as safe enough to survive unchanged. In industrial history, those conditions are often opposites. A factory does not only compete through its product. It competes through the rules of the world surrounding the product. That is the chapter many communities discover too late. The late 20th century remade North American manufacturing through trade agreements, consolidation, currency exposure, and a new ruthlessness about where production should sit. In Canada, the old protective architecture that had once helped domestic manufacturing survive against larger neighboring economies weakened. The Canada, U.S. Free Trade Agreement took effect in 1989. NAFTA followed in 1994. The argument behind such changes was familiar. More open trade would sharpen efficiency, lower costs, and improve competitiveness. In some sectors it did. In others, it also made acquisition and relocation easier. For firms like Champion, this shift mattered enormously. The company had succeeded partly because it was excellent, but also because excellence had operated within a framework that still gave a Canadian specialist room to live. Once that room narrowed, the strategic vulnerabilities became starker. If a larger multinational could acquire the firm, integrate the technology, and rationalize production across a continental footprint, the logic would increasingly favor scale and location over legacy. The stronger Canadian dollar later amplified this danger. When the currency sat lower against the US dollar, manufacturing in Goderich had an embedded advantage. The same wage bill converted differently. The same plant could serve US and export markets at a cost structure that was easier to justify. But exchange rates are temporary allies. When the dollar rises, the hidden subsidy disappears. The same plant, doing the same work with the same skills, suddenly looks more expensive on multinational spreadsheets. Economists and policymakers can argue endlessly over whether such transitions are the price of modernization or the abandonment of industrial sovereignty. For workers, the argument is usually less philosophical. They know only that a plant which once made perfect sense is now being explained to them as a problem. Champion was not alone in facing that pressure. Across Ontario and across North American manufacturing more broadly, foreign takeovers and strategic consolidation increasingly redefined what counted as a viable factory. What had once been a domestic industrial success could become, under new rules, a component in somebody else's optimization plan. This is why the phrase competitiveness often lands so differently on different ears. In a boardroom, competitiveness means cost position, footprint, profitability, and market segmentation. On a factory floor, It often means workers being told to do more, learn more, accept more uncertainty, and trust that the reward will come later. Sometimes it does. Often it does not. The factory can become more competitive and still be shut because the relevant question was never whether it could improve. The question was whether ownership still wanted that particular place. Champion, by the mid-1990s, was about to learn that difference in the most direct way possible. The company's product expertise was genuine. The plant's workforce was skilled. The market position was respectable. None of that prevented the next step, because the next step was not a verdict on whether Champion knew how to build graders. It was a verdict on whether a global buyer saw more value in owning Champion than in leaving it independent. That is the thing about walls. We often think of them as limits. But they can also be shelters. Once the wall around a smaller manufacturing ecosystem comes down, exposure begins. Exposure does not always kill a company. But it makes the company easier to buy, easier to compare, easier to relocate, and easier to disassemble under the clean moral cover of efficiency. By the time those forces are visible in the language of public announcement, most of the decisive work has already been done elsewhere. The formal end of Champion independence arrived in 1997, when Volvo Construction Equipment acquired the company. On paper, the transaction was straightforward. Volvo was expanding and consolidating within construction equipment. Champion brought what Volvo wanted: an established grader line, a respected brand, specialist engineering, and a foothold in a product category where the Swedish parent wanted to be stronger. For Volvo, the deal was strategic. For Champion, it was existential. And for Goderich, it was the start of a long lesson in the difference between being bought and being preserved. This distinction matters. Acquisitions are often introduced locally in the language of confidence. Growth plans, expanded resources, broader markets, synergies, stability, a stronger parent. Sometimes that language is sincere. Sometimes it is partly true. But even when the buyer does not arrive intending immediate destruction, the acquisition still changes the internal logic of the company. The old question, how do we keep Champion strong, becomes a new one: how does Champion fit inside Volvo? That sounds mild until you follow its consequences. A company with one product line and one deep identity is not easy to absorb without changing its meaning. Either the buyer leaves the acquired firm fairly autonomous, or the buyer gradually integrates, rebrands, and rationalizes it. Volvo chose the second path. At first, optimism in Goderich was understandable. The plant was still active. The machines were still respected. The new owner had resources and global scale. Many people likely assumed the acquisition would secure the future rather than hollow it out. But the process that followed had a pattern familiar across industrial history. First, the legal and corporate identity shifts. Then the branding shifts. Then the acquired expertise is integrated into the parent's product architecture. Then the old name is reduced, sidelined, or converted into a historical footnote. The product may continue. The place may continue for a while. But the acquired company's independent story is already being narrowed. Champion experienced exactly that narrowing. The corporate structures were reorganized. The brand began to disappear from formal identity. The first Volvo-branded motor graders eventually replaced the Champion name in the market. Product naming conventions shifted. The yellow machines remained yellow for a while, but paint continuity is not the same as institutional continuity. Customers were being encouraged to trust Volvo where they had once trusted Champion. The technology, meanwhile, was not discarded. It was absorbed. That is a critical point. Volvo did not buy Champion because Champion was irrelevant. It bought Champion because Champion knew how to do something well. This is often the ugliest part of acquisition stories. The value is real enough to purchase, but not respected enough to leave standing as itself. From a distance, such integration can be narrated as progress. Stronger global distribution. Better resources. Unified branding. Broader support. Inside the acquired company, it can feel different, the beginning of erasure. Champion's compact grader line in North Carolina later followed its own more unusual path when Volvo sold that business back to a management-led Champion entity, allowing at least part of the name to survive outside the full-sized grader operation. But in Goderich, the main trajectory was clear. Champion as an independent industrial identity was being stripped down and folded inward. A multinational buyer does not have to hate the acquired company for this to happen. Indifference is enough. Or rather, not indifference exactly. Prioritization. Goderich no longer mattered because it was Champion. It mattered only insofar as it served Volvo's larger network. And that network was about to change again. Once Volvo made larger moves elsewhere in its road machinery business, Goderich would find itself compared not against its own history but against a newer American footprint that better suited continental logic. At that point, acquisition would ripen into closure. The boardroom that made the first decision was far away. The people who lived with the consequences were not. The most painful plant closures are often the ones preceded by promises. After Volvo acquired Champion, Goderich remained active. The plant still built graders. The expertise still existed. The workforce still mattered. It would have been possible, at least for a time, to believe the acquisition had merely changed the sign on the building. But multinational ownership has a longer rhythm than local memory. In 2007, Volvo acquired Ingersoll Rand's Road Development Division, including a much larger U.S. facility in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania. This was a turning point, whether or not everyone in Goderich recognized it immediately. Volvo now had a bigger, more centrally located American road machinery footprint in its largest North American market. That changed the comparative logic of the Canadian plant dramatically. Goderich had once been the center of the Champion world. Under Volvo, it became one node among others. Under the new configuration, it became a node with disadvantages: cross-border complications, a stronger Canadian dollar, a smaller footprint, and a location increasingly easier to define as redundant. None of those things made the workforce less skilled. None of them made the product less real. But they made the plant easier to close within the internal language of corporate rationalization. By 2008, the financial crisis was worsening the atmosphere across manufacturing. Yet the Goderich decision cannot be reduced to the crisis alone. Volvo announced that the motor grader business in Goderich would be moved to Shippensburg by 2010. Roughly 500 jobs would disappear. The company cited competitiveness, profitability, and exchange rate exposure. Those are real factors. They are also the vocabulary by which human dislocation is made to sound procedural. In Goderich, the closure landed as precisely the sort of blow small manufacturing towns understand too well. Not because they are used to it in any emotional sense, but because the logic has become recognizable. A foreign-owned company evaluates a plant, compares costs, and decides another location better serves its strategy. The town is left to absorb the difference between local centrality and global marginality. Reports at the time captured the scale of the loss. Municipal leaders called it devastating. The impact would run beyond the plant itself into the wider regional economy. For four surrounding counties, the factory's wages and purchases had circulated outward. Suppliers, service businesses, transport links, households, all of them felt the closure as more than a line item. One of the most revealing things about these closures is how little drama there sometimes is at the moment of announcement. Anger exists, certainly. So does disbelief. But the response in many small communities is also marked by a heavy resignation, as if people can already hear the larger machinery behind the decision and know that moral argument alone will not reverse it. Volvo promised support measures, counseling, transitions, and the usual soft edges with which hard decisions are wrapped. Some workers could in theory move elsewhere. Some could retrain. Some could retire. But those are not equivalent outcomes. They are different ways of managing loss. None of them restores the structure of meaning the factory supplied. The timing also gave the closure a cruel kind of invisibility. During a major financial crisis, one more plant announcement risks looking ordinary in the wider news cycle. But for the people inside the story, there is nothing ordinary about it. A town does not experience the end of a century-long industrial identity as one more market development. It experiences it as a narrowing of what the future is allowed to be. Production in Goderich wound down through 2009. The machines left in decreasing numbers. Equipment was dispersed. An auction culture replaced a production culture. The last units to leave, reported locally as bound for Egypt, carried a symbolic charge much larger than two machines deserved. They were not just final shipments. They were the visual proof that a place can go from making the product to merely remembering the product in less than a generation. And that is one of the hardest truths in stories like this. The plant often keeps enough competence to survive right until it doesn't. The workers can still build. The line can still run. The customers may still respect the product. Closure does not arrive because the place forgot its trade. It arrives because ownership found another geometry of profit. To say that 500 jobs were lost is accurate. It is also insufficient. A plant closure in a city can disappear into statistical fog. In a town like Goderich, it acquires faces quickly. It reaches the person who expected to finish a career there. The family that built its mortgage assumptions around the plant. The supplier who counted on another year of orders. The local business that understood payday not as an abstraction but as a rhythm of customers. The younger resident who no longer sees a path into stable industrial work without leaving town. This is why manufacturing declines are always more intimate than the national conversation allows. Politicians and economists speak in sectors, productivity, trade flows, exchange rates, investment climates. Workers speak in addresses, years served, who stayed, who left, who had to start over too late in life, who took a package, who commuted, who gave up on the trade altogether. Champion had embedded itself so deeply in Goderich that its closure could not be processed as merely the loss of one employer among many. The company had helped teach the town what it meant to matter beyond itself. The factory sent machines into the world. The town could look outward and say, in effect, we are not only scenic, not only local, not only small. We make something the world uses. Remove that, and something psychological goes with it. Small-town manufacturing closures also expose a generational fracture. Older workers may at least carry memories of the better years, the confidence, the product pride, the sense of continuity. Younger workers inherit the ending, not the arc. They receive uncertainty where an earlier generation received identity. Even when a community stabilizes later, the old industrial confidence rarely returns in the same form. You can rebuild employment. You cannot easily rebuild inheritance. The region around Goderich was hardly alone in this. Ontario lost manufacturing jobs across multiple communities in the 2000s, especially as the currency strengthened and foreign-owned firms rationalized their footprints. But that broader trend can actually deepen the local hurt. When a closure is part of an avalanche, it becomes harder to believe your town is a special case worthy of rescue. The logic starts to feel impersonal in the most defeating sense. It is happening everywhere, and therefore nowhere can plead exception. At the plant itself, the last phase of work must have carried a familiar but terrible contradiction. People still had to do the job professionally, while the structure containing the job was dissolving. Machines still had to be built and moved. Equipment still had to be handled. Processes still had to be followed. A factory often requires its workers to remain competent right through the act of making themselves redundant. There is cruelty in that, even when no individual manager intends it. The closure also redefined how the town would later remember the company. During the active years, Champion could be remembered through skill, paychecks, and production. After closure, memory shifts toward defense. Former workers become custodians. Stories grow sharper around the end. Heritage groups appear. Photos matter more. Old machines gain emotional weight. What had once been ordinary industrial output becomes evidence that the place was real. This is not nostalgia in the shallow sense. It is a struggle against erasure. Communities that lose factories often understand, with painful accuracy, that once production stops, the outside world rapidly starts speaking of the plant in the past tense. Used to. Formerly. Once. The work of memory becomes a counterattack on those words. Goderich has done that work through preservation groups, through surviving local knowledge, through people who still know what a champion looked like, sounded like, and meant. But preservation is not continuation. A restored antique grader can keep the past visible. It cannot reopen the pay envelope. It cannot recreate the social compact under which a town once believed manufacturing belonged to its future. That is why the phrase 500 families matters more than the number suggests. It is not sentimentality. It is scale. In a large place, 500 jobs can be one bad quarter. In a town like Goderich, 500 jobs can alter the local story for a generation. If the story ended with Volvo moving grader production from Goderich to Shippensburg, it would already be a recognizable tragedy. A specialist Canadian manufacturer absorbed, rebranded, relocated, and erased. But the story continues, and the continuation makes the earlier decision look even harsher. In 2014, Volvo Construction Equipment announced that it would discontinue the development and production of Volvo-branded motor graders and backhoe loaders in Europe and the Americas, transferring future production in those categories to its Chinese company, SDLG. The explanation was blunt in the calm, corporate way such explanations are blunt. The premium Volvo-branded grader segment was too small, and the company preferred to serve a broader value segment through SDLG. There, in compressed form, was the afterlife of Champion under multinational logic. First, the specialist is purchased because the product line is worth owning. Then the specialist name is stripped away because the parent wants brand unity. Then the factory most closely identified with the product is closed because a more efficient footprint exists elsewhere. Then the parent later decides the product class itself is not profitable enough in its premium form and moves on. This is why the Goderich story cannot be narrated as a simple case of one plant losing to another better plant. The Pennsylvania move was not the end state. It was an intermediate state. The deeper reality was that Champion had been absorbed into a system whose loyalty to the greater business was conditional. Goderich lost the factory first. Later, the Volvo-branded grader line itself lost its future in the form that had justified buying Champion to begin with. That is the final irony. The place that had spent generations building graders was told, in effect, that someone else could build them more competitively. Then the someone else was eventually told the same thing from an even wider boardroom logic. What had looked like a permanent transfer of industrial leadership now looks, with hindsight, more like a staged retreat. And then the chain continued into China. SDLG, Volvo's Chinese affiliate, became the production home for the category. More than a decade later, in 2025, Volvo completed the divestment of its stake in SDLG as part of a broader refocusing of its China strategy. That transaction does not mean greater DNA vanished instantly, but it completes the symbolic arc with startling neatness. A Swedish multinational bought a Canadian specialist, stripped its name, moved the work, later abandoned the Volvo premium grader line, shifted the category toward China, and then stepped away from that Chinese ownership structure as well. Each individual decision had a logic. That is what makes the sequence so historically important. Industrial erasure rarely happens through one monstrous irrational act. It happens through a chain of rational acts that never answer the larger question. What is being destroyed when a great specialist company is reduced to transferable technology and an optional badge? For Champion, the answer includes more than a plant. It includes a culture of undivided product attention, a Canadian manufacturing lineage, a town's global self-understanding, and a century-long accumulation of embodied expertise. None of those things sit neatly on a balance sheet. That is why they are so easy to lose. And yet the story is not total annihilation. The Champion name persists in diminished but real ways through compact graders and later niche continuations outside the old Goderich scale. Former workers and enthusiasts preserve old machines. The memory survives. But survival of the name is not survival of the industrial world that once made the name powerful. That world was centered on a lakeside plant in Ontario. It is gone. The former plant still stands in altered form. The harbor is still there. The square is still there. The lake still throws the same cold wind inland. Goderich is still beautiful in the stubborn, civic way small lake towns can be beautiful. It still has salt. It still has tourism. It still has new uses for old industrial ground. But it does not build full-size motor graders anymore, and neither does Canada. That last fact matters more than it first appears to. Canada is a country of enormous distances, heavy winters, resource roads, municipal networks, and rural surfaces that do not maintain themselves. Road grading is not optional to a place like this. It is foundational. The country that once housed one of the world's most respected grader makers no longer manufactures the machine class at all. Something important is revealed in that gap. Nations can continue using essential equipment long after they have stopped making it. Towns can continue functioning long after they have stopped producing the thing that gave them unusual reach. Life goes on. The harbor still loads salt. Tourists still photograph the square. New businesses occupy old industrial addresses. But continuity of life should not be mistaken for continuity of capability. Champion's disappearance is therefore not just a nostalgic story about a lost brand. It is a story about capability leaving a country one decision at a time. About the difference between consuming infrastructure and building the machines that make infrastructure possible. About what happens when a specialist manufacturer survives world wars, depressions, and technological transitions, only to be undone by acquisition, rationalization, and the arithmetic of multinational ownership. The easiest version of the story is to say that global competition killed Champion. That is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Global competition does not act by itself. People act through it. Boards choose. Executives compare. Shareholders accept. Governments open or fail to defend certain industrial possibilities. Exchange rates rise. Takeovers happen. Facilities are ranked. A town wakes up one morning and finds out it is no longer central to a business it spent a century building. The hardest version of the story is also the truest. Champion did almost everything a specialist manufacturer is supposed to do. It built a respected product. It improved the machine. It earned trust. It reached global markets. It made itself indispensable within its category. And even that was not enough. That is why this story belongs in Rust and Glory. Because the ruin only matters if the glory was real. And here the glory was real. A Quaker Mechanics road machine became a Canadian industrial dynasty. A small town on Lake Huron sent yellow graders to more than 95 countries. Operators thousands of miles away recognized a maple leaf and a name from Goderich. For nearly a century, a factory by the water taught the ground to hold. Then ownership changed, the name was stripped, the work moved, and the world carried on as if this were inevitable. It was not inevitable. It was decided. And that is what was lost in Goderich. Not just a plant. Not just 500 jobs. Not just a brand. A whole way of proving that a small place could build something the world relied on.